This didn't happen in some distant, foreign land. It wasn't overseas, in the shadowy corners of an enemy territory. No, this story unfolds right here, inside the United States, on American soil, with American citizens living just over the horizon. Throughout much of the 20th century, the U.S. military conducted a series of astonishingly dangerous weapon tests within its own borders. It's a chapter of history that for a long time was deliberately kept out of the public eye. Most people were never told, some were never warned, and a tragic number were directly exposed to the consequences. It all started to escalate during the Second World War. The atmosphere was thick with fear and uncertainty. The world was at war, and a sense of extreme urgency gripped the nation's leaders. The government, driven by the belief that speed mattered more than anything else, decided that the American mainland itself would become their laboratory. The vast, seemingly empty deserts of the American West were chosen first. Places like Nevada, Utah, and New Mexico seemed perfect, remote, desolate, and far from the bustling cities of the coasts. Or so they thought. The reality was that these areas weren't empty at all. People lived there. Small towns, ranches, and indigenous communities dotted the landscape, their residents completely unaware of the monumental and hazardous experiments about to take place in their backyard. These were the downwinders, people who lived in the path of the radioactive fallout that would drift from the test sites. They were never asked for their consent. They were never consulted. The decisions were made behind closed doors, stamped with the word classified, and sealed away from public scrutiny. This wasn't just a single event, a one-off test that went wrong. We're talking about dozens, even hundreds of tests conducted over several decades. From the 1940s through the Cold War, the sky in these remote regions would periodically light up with an unnatural, terrifying dawn. The tests crossed state lines, from the deserts of Nevada to the shores of the Pacific and even the Gulf of Mexico. Each explosion released a silent, invisible cloud of radioactive particles that would be carried by the wind for hundreds of miles, settling on towns, farms, and water supplies. For the people living nearby, life changed in ways they couldn't understand at the time. They witnessed the ground shake and saw strange, mushroom-shaped clouds rising on the horizon. They were often told these were just routine military exercises. Some were even encouraged to watch the atmospheric tests, treated as a patriotic spectacle. School children were instructed to practice duck and cover drills, not just for a potential enemy attack, but for the tests happening just a few hundred miles away. They didn't know that the dust settling on their homes, their crops, and their children playing outside contained elements that would have devastating long-term health effects. The consequences began to surface slowly, then all at once, an unusual number of cancers started appearing in these small, tight-knit communities. Thyroid disease, leukemia, and other rare illnesses became heartbreakingly common. Generations of families were affected, watching their loved ones suffer without knowing the true cause. For decades, their pleas for answers were met with denial and silence from the government. The official line was that the tests were safe and that the radiation levels were too low to cause any harm. But the mounting evidence in these communities told a very different story. It wasn't just atmospheric nuclear tests. The military also experimented with chemical and biological agents on its own people, often without their knowledge. In one infamous series of tests, the Navy sprayed bacteria over the city of San Francisco to study how a biological attack might spread. Residents were told it was a harmless simulation. In St. Louis, a low-income housing project was repeatedly sprayed with a chemical compound, with residents being told it was to test a smokescreen to protect the city from aerial attacks. They were never informed that the compound was mixed with a radioactive additive. The soldiers and personnel directly involved in these tests were also exposed to incredible risks. They were ordered to march into blast zones shortly after a nuclear detonation to test equipment and gauge the effects of radiation. They were often given minimal protective gear and assured that it was safe. Many of these veterans would later fight long, difficult battles for recognition and compensation for the health problems they developed as a result of their service. Their stories are a crucial, often overlooked, part of this history. The struggle for truth and justice has been a long and arduous one. It took the tireless work of activists, journalists, and the downwinders themselves to bring these stories to light. Through declassified documents, whistleblower testimonies, and congressional hearings, the full scope of this domestic testing program slowly began to emerge from the shadows. In 1990, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act was passed. a landmark piece of legislation that provided financial compensation to some of the individuals affected by the nuclear testing. While it was a critical step, for many, it was too little, too late. Many victims had already passed away, and many others found themselves ineligible due to the strict and often arbitrary geographic and time-based criteria. Today, the legacy of these tests is still very much with us. It's in the stories of the families who continue to fight for recognition. It's in the ongoing health problems faced by communities downwind of the test sites. And it serves as a powerful and sobering reminder of the ethical lines that can be crossed in the name of national security. This isn't just a story about the past. It's a conversation about accountability, transparency, and the profound responsibility a government has to its own citizens. This is where it all began, and its echoes are still heard today. Thanks for watching. If this story resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into forgotten history. 1945. A new age dawns, not with light, but with an earth-shattering flash. The atomic age had begun, announced by a terrifying mushroom cloud. But this wasn't a story that only happened in history books about faraway lands. While the world remembers Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a darker, more secret chapter of the atomic story was unfolding right here, at home. The epicenter wasn't a distant island, it was the Nevada desert. Welcome to the Nevada test site. From the outside, just a vast, empty stretch of American landscape. But from 1951 onwards, this place became ground zero for the Cold War's most dangerous experiments. We weren't just building these weapons, we were detonating them inside our own borders, hundreds of times. And not just underground. These were atmospheric tests. Bombs exploded on towers high above the ground, in full view of the sky, sending shockwaves and radioactive clouds billowing into the atmosphere. Imagine a countdown clock ticking to zero, followed by a light brighter than 1,000 suns, and a mushroom cloud climbing miles into the sky. Now imagine this wasn't happening in a sealed-off, isolated corner of the world. Some of these tests were conducted just miles from small, unsuspecting towns in Nevada, Utah, and Arizona. Entire communities would gather on hillsides, watching these man-made suns rise in the distance. A strange and spectacular light show on the horizon. Government officials and military spokesmen assured them it was perfectly safe. Newsreels from the time show smiling families, told that these tests were a necessary part of keeping America secure. They were patriotic displays, a sign of our nation's strength. But they were wrong, fatally wrong. What went up had to come down, and it came down as radioactive fallout. This invisible poison drifted on the wind for hundreds of miles, blanketing towns and farms. People described it as a fine, white dust, falling silently from the sky, almost like snow. They called it atomic snow. Children, unaware of the danger, played outside as this strange dust settled on their hair and clothes. They breathed it in. It settled on the grass that farm animals grazed on, contaminating the milk. It settled in the water supply that people drank from. The consequences were slow, insidious, and devastating. Within years, doctors in these downwind communities started noticing alarming trends. Cancer rates, particularly leukemia and thyroid cancer, began to skyrocket. Then came the birth defects, a wave of heartbreak and tragedy that swept through families who had no idea what was happening to them. A generation was being poisoned, and a government that promised them safety knew it was happening. These people were given a name, downwinders. They were the human cost of the arms race, sacrificed for data and deterrence for decades. Their pleas and their illnesses were ignored or denied. It wasn't until 1990, after years of activism and mounting evidence, that the government finally passed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, offering a formal apology and financial compensation to the victims. But for so many, it was too little, too late. Thousands never lived long enough to see that acknowledgement. Their lives cut short by the fallout they were told was harmless. And even as the evidence mounted, the testing continued. In the cold calculus of the Cold War, the data gathered from each blast was deemed more valuable than the lives it destroyed. Scientists in bunkers, miles from the detonation, would meticulously record every detail of the blast, every measure of its power, while downwind, the invisible toll was mounting. The fire of 1,000 suns, it turned out, had a very long and very dark shadow. But the story of secret weapons testing on American soil doesn't end with nuclear fire. There was another threat, being developed and tested, one that you couldn't see or hear. It was silent, invisible, and in its own way, just as deadly. We were not only mastering the atom, but we were also weaponizing chemistry. And the testing grounds for these new poisons were sometimes the last places you would ever expect. Public parks, city streets, and even subway systems became unwitting laboratories in a series of experiments that remain one of the most shocking and little-known chapters of our recent history. The fallout from these tests wouldn't be radioactive, but it would be just as toxic. And the story of how and why it happened is coming up next. Thanks for watching. If you found this story important, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the hidden parts of our history. Click the notification bell so you don't miss our next video where we uncover the shocking story of secret chemical testing on American citizens. Stay curious. Did you know the United States military once turned its own country into a laboratory? It's a chilling chapter of history that many people still aren't aware of. For decades, top-secret programs involved testing some of the most dangerous substances known to man, not in some remote, uninhabited desert, but right here, on American soil. This wasn't just a few isolated incidents. We're talking about a systematic, long-running series of experiments involving potent chemical weapons. Imagine wearing a gas mask, not in a foreign war zone, but in your own backyard. That was the reality for some. The military experimented with a terrifying cocktail of agents, including nerve agents like sarin and VX. These are substances so deadly that a single drop can be fatal. The very symbols that represent these chemical compounds spell out a story of immense destructive power, and they were being deliberately released into our environment. It's hard to fathom, but the documents prove it. But the testing didn't stop with chemicals. They also ventured into the realm of biological substances. Under the microscope, scientists cultivated bacteria and other microorganisms not to cure diseases, but to potentially weaponize them. These experiments were designed to understand how biological agents could be spread, how they would affect people, and how they could be used in warfare. The irony is that in their quest to prepare for a hypothetical attack, they unleashed real-life risks upon their own citizens. And where did these tests happen? You might think they were confined to secure, isolated facilities far from civilization. But that's not the whole story. Some of these experiments were conducted alarmingly close to major cities. A fine, invisible, miscarried, simulated, or actual agents could drift over a bustling city skyline, its inhabitants completely oblivious to the danger lurking in the air they breathe. The sheer audacity of releasing these substances near populated areas is staggering. Of course, many tests did occur within the confines of military bases. Signs warning of restricted zones and top-secret classifications were a common sight. These bases became the primary proving grounds where controlled environments could be set up. But even within these fenced-off areas, the subjects of the experiments were not volunteers who understood the risks. They were American soldiers, men and women who had signed up to defend their country. These soldiers were often intentionally exposed to chemical and biological agents. Picture this, a group of young, healthy soldiers being led into a test chamber. The doors seal shut and a gas is released. They were told it was for training, for testing equipment, for national security, but they were never given the full story, the true nature of the substances they were inhaling, the long-term health risks. The fact that they were, in essence, human guinea pigs, all of this was concealed. They were given documents to sign, but key information was often redacted, blacked out, or simply omitted. A soldier might read a briefing paper, thinking they understood the mission, but the most crucial details were deliberately hidden. They were following orders, trusting their superiors, unaware that this trust was being profoundly betrayed. The very system they swore to uphold was using them as disposable test subjects for its most dangerous experiments. It wasn't just a few individuals, either. Entire units, hundreds of soldiers at a time, were used in these tests. A formation of troops, standing at attention, might be ordered to march through a field that had just been sprayed with a chemical agent, or to test new protective gear against a live biological stimulant. They were a captive and convenient population for researchers to study. The data collected from their exposure was considered invaluable, far more important than their individual health and well-being. The story gets even more disturbing because it wasn't just soldiers who were affected. Civilian populations were also secretly and deliberately exposed. One of the most infamous examples took place in the San Francisco Bay Area, where the military released bacteria from a ship to track airflow over the city. They wanted to see how a biological agent might disperse in an urban environment. Similar tests were conducted in the New York City subway system, where light bulbs filled with bacteria were dropped onto the tracks, to see how the particles would travel through the tunnels and stations carried by the trains, and the crowds. Throughout all of this, the public was never informed. There were no warnings, no public service announcements, no town hall meetings. People went about their daily lives, riding the subway, walking through city parks, completely unaware that they were part of a massive, undeclared military experiment. Newspapers reported on local events, but there was a giant, missing headline story that was happening right under their noses, but was completely invisible, shrouded in secrecy. Inevitably, people got sick. In San Francisco, after the secret spraying, a local hospital saw a spike in unusual pneumonia cases, and one man died. But when concerns were raised, no connection was ever admitted by the government. The illnesses were dismissed as coincidences, as naturally occurring outbreaks. The families of the victims had no idea that the sickness that struck their loved ones might have been deliberately released into the air by their own government. They were left with questions, grief, and no answers. To ensure the truth never came out, the records were sealed. Thousands of pages of data, research notes, and field reports were locked away in filing cabinets, stamped top secret, and hidden from public view for decades. This wall of silence was designed to protect the programs and the people behind them from any legal or public backlash. The closure of those filing cabinet drawers symbolized the closing of a chapter that the government wanted permanently forgotten. And what about those who knew the truth? The soldiers who participated, the scientists who had second thoughts. Witnesses were silenced. This could mean a lot of things. It could mean direct threats, intimidation, or being sworn to secrecy under penalty of treason. It could also mean discrediting anyone who tried to speak out, labeling them as unstable or unpatriotic. The image of a shadowed figure represents the immense pressure and fear that kept people from revealing what they had seen and done. Many of these experiments were only revealed decades later, not through voluntary disclosure, but through the persistent efforts of journalists, whistleblowers, and congressional investigations. Documents slowly became declassified, stamped with the word that finally allowed the truth to surface. It was only then that the full scope of these programs began to emerge, shocking the nation and betraying a generation's trust in its leaders. But even today, the story is not complete. Some details remain classified. You can look at a declassified document about these tests and still find entire paragraphs and pages blacked out with thick black ink. We know what happened, but we may never know the full extent of the substances used, the exact locations of all the tests, or the true number of people affected. The secrets are still being kept. The official justification, then and now, has always been national security. The argument was that in the midst of the Cold War, the United States had to be prepared for any potential chemical or biological attack from its enemies. The Pentagon building stands as a symbol of this immense responsibility to protect the nation. From their perspective, these tests, however ethically questionable, were a necessary evil to ensure the country's survival in a dangerous world. But that justification comes at a terrible cost. The true cost was human health. Soldiers and civilians developed chronic illnesses, cancers, respiratory problems, and neurological disorders. Families watched their loved ones suffer and die without knowing why. The image of a family holding hands represents the deep, personal impact that these abstract national security decisions had on real people, real lives. The pain was real, even if the cause was hidden. And beyond the physical harm, the cost was trust. The social contract between the government and its people is built on trust, the belief that the government will protect its citizens, not endanger them. These experiments shattered that trust. The American flag, a symbol of unity and protection, appears cracked, representing a fundamental break in that sacred relationship. How can you trust a system that secretly uses you as a test subject? The damage, both to human bodies and to the nation's soul, couldn't be undone. You can't reverse the illnesses. You can't restore the years of life lost. You can't unrelease bacteria into a city. Signs warning of contaminated land serve as a permanent reminder of the lingering physical legacy of these tests. The poison seeped into the soil and, metaphorically, into the public's consciousness. And in the end, accountability never fully came. There were hearings, there were reports, and there were some apologies, but very few individuals were ever held responsible. The system protected itself. The image of an empty courtroom is a powerful symbol of the justice that was never served for the countless victims. The perpetrators remained shielded by national security, and the full truth remained buried in classified files. It's a somber end to the story, but it's not the complete end. Because even after all this was revealed, the testing didn't stop there. Thank you for watching. If this story shocked you, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon to learn more about the hidden histories that have shaped our world. Follow us for more deep dives into subjects that matter. By the time the Cold War was in full swing, weapon testing had become routine. Just another part of the geopolitical chess game. Secrecy was not just encouraged, it was normalized. It became the default setting for entire branches of the government. This veil of secrecy allowed for decisions that would have catastrophic consequences for generations. Entire regions, vast swaths of American land, were contaminated. Imagine landscapes once pristine, now dotted with warning signs, the soil and water poisoned by invisible threats. Some of these areas are still uninhabitable today, ghost towns in the desert, abandoned not because of economic collapse, but because the very ground they were built on became toxic. The cleanup, where it happened, was a monumental task. It took decades, involving armies of workers in hazmat suits, painstakingly trying to reverse the irreversible. But even with these efforts, some sites remain dangerously toxic. Fences with radiation symbols are not relics of a bygone era. They are present-day warnings, cordoning off areas that may never be safe again. And the human cost? It's immeasurable. Families still live with the consequences. We see it in the faces of elderly couples who have watched their neighbors and loved ones suffer from mysterious illnesses. The health effects weren't just a single-generation tragedy. They were passed down, a toxic inheritance of genetic damage and chronic disease, creating a painful family timeline marked by loss. Eventually, the government admitted parts of the truth. There were carefully worded press conferences, symbolic gestures of transparency, but they never revealed the full story. Crucial documents remain classified, with key details redacted, leaving a picture that is intentionally incomplete. To this day, many tests remain unknown, their locations and impacts mere question marks on a map. And some victims, the people who paid the ultimate price, were never even identified. Their stories lost, represented only by an empty chair. It's crucial to understand that these tests weren't accidents. They weren't unforeseen tragedies. They were calculated decisions meticulously planned around military tables. Each test was approved, a hand stamping a document, sealing the fate of the land and the people on it. These decisions were made behind closed doors, far from public scrutiny or debate. And where did this happen? Not in some distant, foreign land. This happened on American soil. These tests were conducted on the American people, citizens who were unknowingly living in the middle of a battlefield they never knew existed. History remembers the victories. We build monuments to battles won and heroes celebrated, but history often forgets the cost. The quiet sacrifices and the collateral damage that gets swept under the rug. The faces fade, the stories blur. This is that cost. This is the story of the land that remains scarred, the water that remains tainted. It's a cost that is still with us, a quiet but persistent legacy marked by modern warning signs and lingering questions. This is the story of what happened when the U.S. military tested its most dangerous weapons, not on an enemy, but on its own country. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing for more deep dives into the history we're not always taught.